The entire rink went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. That's how long it took for everyone watching to realize what had just happened. And then the laughter started. It came from the boards. First, a couple of the assistant coaches, one of whom had a clipboard tucked under his arm and a coffee going cold in his hand. Then it spread up into the bleachers, where the scouts and the parents and the hangers-on were sitting. And by the time it reached the back row, it wasn't really laughter anymore. It was more like relief, the kind that comes when something you were slightly uncomfortable about suddenly has an easy explanation. The kid was a joke. That was the explanation. They could all relax now. The kid didn't move. He was standing at the glass near the Zamboni entrance, still wearing his jacket, a faded green thing with a broken zipper that he'd been holding shut with his left hand for the better part of the morning. He wasn't in gear. He didn't have skates on. He had been watching the Harwick Jr. Tryouts for 2 hours through the glass, his breath fogging little circles against the surface every time he exhaled, and when the session broke for water, he had knocked on the door and asked if he could go on. The man who opened the door was Gil Beaumont. He ran the program. He had been running it for 19 years, which in junior hockey terms meant he had seen everything, or believed he had. He looked at the kid. Maybe 19, maybe 20, hard to tell, with the kind of stillness in his face that you either learned young or were born with. And he said, fairly enough, that tryouts were closed, that roster spots had already been narrowed down, and that there was a process. The kid said he understood the process. Beaumont said that was great. The kid said he'd like to try anyway. Someone near the board said something low, and 2 or 3 people laughed. Beaumont himself didn't laugh, but he smiled a little. The smile of a man who has been in the sport long enough to know how to handle a moment like this with minimal embarrassment to all parties. He asked the kid what position he played. The kid said center. Beaumont said they had centers. The kid said he knew. He said he'd probably get scored on. He said put him in anyway. That was the part that made the bleachers go. His name was Rowan Duff. He was 22 years old, and he had grown up in a place called Mattice, which is a small town in northern Ontario that most people in the room had never heard of, and a few would have struggled to find on a map. He had driven 6 hours to get to the Harwick facility that morning, leaving before 4 a.m., in a truck that belonged to his uncle, and that had a heating system, best described as optimistic. He had eaten a gas station sandwich somewhere around Cochrane, and arrived with 40 minutes to spare, which he had spent sitting in the parking lot, hands on the wheel, watching the facility lights come on one by one through the windshield. He had not been invited. He had found the tryout posting on a community board at a Tim Hortons 3 weeks earlier, written the date on the back of a receipt, and driven 6 hours because it was the closest Junior A program, holding open evaluations within a distance he could afford. None of the people in the bleachers knew any of this. What they saw was a young man in a broken jacket who had shown up uninvited to a closed tryout and asked to play against players who had been scouted and recruited, and whose parents were, in some cases, sitting in those very bleachers having driven considerably shorter distances in considerably warmer vehicles. What they saw was a punchline. Beaumont was about to thank the kid and close the door when the other voice spoke up. It came from a man named Trottier. No one called him by his first name, not even people who had known him for years, and he had been in the game long enough that his first name had simply stopped mattering. He had been sitting at the far end of the bench with a notepad and a pen and a thermos of coffee, and he had been quiet all morning, which was how he usually was, which was why people sometimes forgot he was there. He said, without looking up from his notepad, "Let the kid skate." Beaumont looked at him. Trottier said it again, still not looking up. 4 words, "Let the kid skate." There was a brief silence in which several things happened simultaneously. The coaches near the boards exchanged a look. One of the scouts in the bleachers shifted in his seat, and Rowan Duff, standing at the door in his green jacket, did not change his expression at all. Beaumont said fine. He said, "Someone get the kid a pair of skates. There is a particular kind of cold that lives inside an ice rink in October in northern Ontario, and it is different from the cold outside. Outside, the cold is blunt and immediate. Inside the rink, it is patient. It gets into you slowly, through the metal of the bleachers, and the concrete under the rubber matting, and the air that has been cycling through the same refrigeration system since 1987. Rowan had spent enough time in rinks like this one to stop noticing it years ago. He laced up the borrowed skates, a size too big, which he noted and adjusted for without comment, and stepped onto the ice. The remaining players from the tryout session were watching from the far end. There were 11 of them. They had been through 3 days of cuts already, and they were tired, and they were good. The kind of good that gets documented in spreadsheets and talked about in parents' group chats, and most of them had been playing organized hockey since they were old enough to have opinions about their stick flex. Beaumont told 2 of them to run a defensive drill. He told Rowan to come in on a 2-on-1. The first time down the ice, Rowan carried the puck across the blue line and decked right, and the defender bit, and he went backhand over the blocker's glove, and the puck hit the crossbar and came back out. No goal, technically. Someone in the bleachers said something that was meant to be heard. Beaumont nodded at them to go again. The second time, Rowan came in slower. This was the thing about him that no one had seen yet, because there had been nothing to see it in, the way he moved when he was thinking. Not slower like a player who was tired or hesitant, but slower in the way that meant he was reading something the rest of the people on the ice hadn't finished reading yet. He held the puck on his backhand for a beat longer than made sense, and the defender adjusted, and in the half-second that it took for the defender to adjust, Rowan put the puck exactly where the defender had just been. Top corner. Clean. The goalie hit the post with his stick, the way goalies do when they're annoyed at themselves rather than at the shooter. Trottier wrote something down. The bleachers were quieter now, but not silent. Quiet like a room where people are recalibrating. Beaumont said again. The word came out a little differently this time. The third drill was different. This was not a scoring drill. This was a defensive zone coverage sequence that the team had been running for 2 days, with specific assignments and specific reads, and the players knew it, and Rowan did not. Beaumont explained it once, briefly, the way you explain something to someone you're not entirely sure will understand it. Rowan listened. He asked one question. Where does the weak side winger release if the puck goes behind the net? Beaumont told him. Rowan nodded. They ran the drill. He was not perfect. He was half a step late on the first rotation, and he overcommitted on the second, and Beaumont called both of those things out, which was accurate and fair. But on the third rotation, something happened that Beaumont did not call out, because he was not entirely sure how to describe it. Rowan read a pass that hadn't been made yet, not in the way that looks like luck, but in the way that looks like someone solved the equation before the problem was finished being written on the board. He was exactly where the puck was going to be, not where it was, and he came out of the defensive zone with it like he had known the whole time. The player who'd thrown the pass. A kid from Barrie whose father was in the bleachers with a very nice jacket and a habit of taking notes on his phone, stood at the blue line for a moment with his stick still in the follow-through position, staring at the space where the puck used to be. Trottier had stopped writing. He was just watching now. After the session, Rowan went back to the Zamboni door and sat on the rubber matting and started unlacing the borrowed skates. He did it carefully, the way you return something that isn't yours. One of the equipment managers came over and took the skates without saying anything, and Rowan put his boots back on and stood up and began to zip, to hold shut, his jacket. He had not been told to stay. He had not been told to leave either. He was walking toward the main exit when he heard his name. It was a woman at the scorekeeper's table near the far boards. She had to say it twice before he realized she meant him, because very few people in that building knew his name. She told him Trottier wanted to see him. He stood there for a moment. Outside, his uncle's truck was sitting in the parking lot, getting colder. He had planned to start driving back by 3 to make it home before dark, and it was already past 2. He walked back across the facility. Trottier was at the bench, still with his notepad, the thermos now empty beside him. He was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the general air of someone who had stopped being impressed by impressive things a long time ago. Which meant that when something did impress him, it registered differently than it did on people who were still easily impressed. He looked at Rowan for a moment before he said anything. Then he said, "Where'd you play before this?" Rowan told him. Mattice Minor League. 2 seasons with a Timmins rec team before the rec team folded. He'd played some pickup in Kapuskasing last winter. Trottier said, "No, junior." Rowan said, "No." Trottier wrote something down. He said, "The weak side read on the third rotation." "Who taught you that?" Rowan said, "No one taught him that. He said he just saw it." Trottier looked at him for a moment longer and then looked back at his notepad. He clicked his pen once. He said, "We have a skate Thursday morning at 7. Be here." Rowan said he lived 6 hours away. Trottier said he was aware. He said, "Thursday morning, 7 o'clock." He said it the way people say things when they are not making a request. Then he turned back to his notepad and said nothing else. Rowan stood there for 3 or 4 seconds, which is long enough for a lot of things to happen inside a person. Long enough to think about the drive and the gas and the uncle's truck, and the 6 hours of Ontario highway and the gas station sandwich and the fact that no one had told him he'd made anything, that all he'd been told was to be at a rink at 7 in the morning on Thursday. He said, "Okay." He walked back to the exit. He did not tell his uncle much. He said the tryout went all right. He asked if he could borrow the truck again Thursday. His uncle said the truck needed an oil change. Rowan said he'd take care of it. He spent Tuesday night watching game tape on a laptop that ran hot enough to be a legitimate heat source. He was not watching any team in particular. He was watching centers, the way they moved without the puck, the way they released from defensive coverage, the way the good ones were always a problem for the other team even when no one was watching them. He had been doing this for years, in the absence of coaches who had the time or inclination to teach him things that weren't being taught in the Mattice arena, where the ice time was shared between 3 age groups and the boards on the north end had a soft spot that everyone knew about and worked around. He fell asleep with the laptop still open. Thursday, 7 a.m. Harwick Arena. He was there at 6:45. Beaumont was not there. This was Trottier's session, a smaller one. 8 players, no parents, no outside eyes, the kind of practice where things get figured out rather than displayed. Trottier didn't acknowledge Rowan's arrival. He put a puck on the ice and told everyone to warm up, and watched from the bench with his arms folded. 45 minutes in, he stopped the session. He told the 8 players to line up at the blue line. He told them he was going to describe a scenario, a late-game defensive situation, 2-goal lead, 40 seconds left, puck in their own zone, and he wanted each of them to talk through what they'd do. Not do it, just say it. He went down the line. The answers were technically correct, most of them. The players had been coached well, and they knew the vocabulary of the game at this level, and they said the right things in the right order. Protect the house, limit second opportunities, forced the play wide. When he got to Rowan, Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Depends on who's on the ice for them." Trottier said, "What?" Rowan said, "If their best finisher is in the left circle and their set play goes back door, you can't play it the same way as if he's on the weak side. The read changes. The coverage changes. The 2-goal cushion means you can afford to be aggressive on one look, but not on both." Trottier said, "And if you're wrong?" Rowan said, "Then you're wrong and you live with it. But if you don't make the read, you're just hoping they miss." Nobody said anything. Trottier looked at him for a long moment. Then he clicked his pen and wrote something down, which was what he always did when something mattered enough to record. He didn't make the main roster that fall. This is the part of the story that doesn't go the way the movies go. He didn't make the roster because the roster was already structured around players who had been developing within the system for 2 or 3 seasons. And because there are things that game tape and 6-hour drives cannot entirely compensate for, and because the world of junior hockey is particular about its timelines. Beaumont told him this directly and without cruelty. He said Rowan was not ready for the lineup as it was currently constructed. He said the structural fit wasn't there. Rowan said he understood. Then Beaumont told him that Trottier had recommended a development assignment with the affiliated program in Hearst. 40 minutes north. He said it wasn't the main club. He said the ice time would be different. The travel would be harder. The pay, such as it was, which wasn't much, would be minimal. He said Trottier had recommended it specifically. He used that word, specifically. He drove to Hearst. The ice in the Hearst facility was narrower than Harwick's. The dressing room had one working hairdryer and a smell that no number of deodorizer pucks had ever fully addressed. The head coach there was a retired defenseman named Vachon, who had played 4 seasons of professional hockey in the 90s and had opinions about defensive zone coverage that he was willing to share in significant detail. Rowan listened to all of them. He played 41 games that season. He led the affiliate in primary assists, which is a statistic that matters to certain people and not to others. He blocked more shots than any forward on the roster, which is a statistic that matters to a slightly different set of certain people. He did not score a spectacular number of goals. He did a very large number of quiet things that added up, and the people who were watching for those things noticed them, and the people who weren't didn't. Trottier came to 3 games. He never sat in an obvious spot. He sat in sections where people weren't paying attention to the section, with his notepad on his knee, and he watched. In February, the main club had an injury. The center they lost was a name player. Recruited out of Quebec, good hands, the kind of player whose absence gets mentioned in the program notes. 2 ribs, 6 to 8 weeks. Beaumont called Rowan up. The first game back at Harwick, Rowan dressed in a room where half the players knew who he was, and half the players had a general sense of him, and 2 players had been there the day he knocked on the door in the green jacket and got laughed at by the bleachers. Neither of those 2 players said anything to him. He did not say anything to them. He played 12 minutes in that first game. Not a starring role, not a headline, just 12 minutes of honest ice time in a 4-2 win, where he finished with 1 assist and a +2 and a shot block in the third, that nobody in the building fully registered except Trottier, who was 3 rows up from the visitor's bench with his notepad, and who wrote 1 line after the block, and then didn't write anything else for the rest of the period. After the game, in the corridor outside the dressing room, one of the scouts who had been in the bleachers the day of the tryout stopped him, not with any fanfare, just stopped beside him, the way someone does when they want to say something but haven't fully decided on the words yet. He said, "That tryout day. I didn't think much of it at the time." Rowan said, "Okay." The scout said, "Trottier's usually right." Rowan said, "Yeah, that was the whole conversation." The scout nodded and went back to the corridor, and Rowan went back to the dressing room. By the end of the season, Beaumont had offered him a full contract for the following year. Not a development contract, a roster spot. He signed it in Beaumont's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, with a pen that Beaumont handed him, and a window beside the desk that looked out over the parking lot and, beyond it, the edge of the arena roof. He didn't make a show of it. He read the document, which took longer than Beaumont expected, and then he signed where indicated. On the drive back, he stopped at a Tim Hortons just off the highway. The same chain, a different location. And he sat at a table near the window with a coffee he didn't finish, and he didn't look at his phone, and he didn't call anyone. He just sat there for a while, watching the cars go past on the highway, in the particular way that people sit when they are in the middle of something they will only fully understand later. Then he got in the truck and drove north. The green jacket, for the record, he still had it. He didn't wear it to the rink anymore. It lived on a hook by the door of the apartment he eventually rented in Hearst, and when he moved to Harwick at the start of the following season, he brought it with him, still hanging on its hook, because it was a size too big and the zipper was still broken, and there was no practical reason to keep it. He kept it anyway. There's a kind of proof that doesn't come from being told you were right. It doesn't come from an apology or a standing ovation, or someone in the bleachers changing their mind out loud. It comes from the thing that you do, quietly, in the place where no one was expecting you to do it, and the record of it is just that it happened. You were there. You did the thing. The puck went where you put it. That's all. That's the whole proof. The rink remembers. The notepad remembers. The ice remembers nothing. Which is maybe the most honest thing about it. It gets scraped clean after every session, the same for everyone, and whatever you left on it is just what you did while you were there. Rowan knew that. He had known it since Mattice, since the first time he laced up on ice that wasn't quite level and taught himself to read a play by watching where everyone wasn't. He knew it when he knocked on the door. He knew it when the bleachers laughed.